Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Industry Needs, the State of Tech. My name is Annie Garniva, and I'm the Vice President of Policy and Special Initiatives of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. Thank you to all of our members that have joined us this afternoon, and a special thank you to our sponsors today, Amazon, Google, LinkedIn, Meta, and Verizon for supporting this entire series. As many of you know, NYC ETC supports the workforce development community to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. The coalition's membership is composed of 200 workforce providers, education institutions, and labor management organizations that provide job training and employment services to nearly 600,000 New Yorkers. Although probably that number's gone way up since COVID, to be frank. Today, in the second installment in our multi-part industry needs by sector series, we'll discuss the state of tech and strategize how to grow businesses and train workers in the variety of subsectors and occupations that make up the evolving tech sector. We have the pleasure of hearing from a great panel of leaders that represent that variety of businesses in the sector. And you can expect this kind of work from all of our industry needs by sector series. They're all employer and business centric. To help the workforce field really get more in tune with the business side of things and just really be hearing directly from employers themselves. So very grateful to have our panelists with us today. Today, New York City is home to some 10,000 tech companies and startups and remains the second strongest tech hub in the world. Despite widespread job loss and economic turmoil due to the pandemic, demand for tech occupations remains strong. While software engineers and developers took the top spot as the most in-demand jobs, there is high demand for a diversity of tech positions in the sector and in other non-tech sectors, as well as non-tech roles within tech companies. With the tech sector being a relatively young sector in comparison to others and most of its fast growth happening in the last 20 years, there is a need to build and ensure career pathways that include robust programming, sustainable talent pipelines, and greater access to opportunities for a more diverse talent pool. And all of this needs to be proactively supported by collaborative public policy. Today, we'll discuss that and more with the goal of demystifying the sector and how to guide job seekers to the right training programs and careers. All participants should know that you will be muted for the duration of this webinar. I'll moderate a discussion with our speakers and discuss the state of their communities and what else can be done to keep businesses open and get workers employed. Before we start with our panel, we'll hear from James Parrott, Director of Economic and Fiscal Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School, who will provide a labor update on the sector. Nice to see you as always, James. Take it away.
Thank you, Annie. It's good to be here this afternoon, and especially with such an expert set of panelists who will follow this brief overview that I'll try to provide of the industry and its workforce in New York City and what's happened in the last couple of years. Lena, if I could have the next slide. So just to give you a quick sense of the ground I want to cover in these opening remarks, the tech ecosystem in New York City, and I'll explain that in a minute, is a dynamic force in many respects in New York City. It had been growing strongly in the past decade, helping New York City to diversify its economy beyond an emphasis in the past on the financial sector and media and culture to some extent. It's also continued to grow during the pandemic, and some of the business changes in the way business is conducted have relied more heavily on tech in the process. We'll look at the components that make up the industry. We'll look at employment trends and demographics. A lot of my work has been focused on trying to understand the impact of the pandemic on New York City's economy and workforce. So I will speak to what I see as an immediate priority for the city in terms of redeploying tens of thousands of workers dislocated, many probably permanently in face-to-face service industries, And yet at the same time, we see this likely resumption in strong growth in the tech sector that could provide many promising employment opportunities for workers who have been permanently displaced by the pandemic. There's also a challenge of getting more New York City residents into the tech pipeline. So tech offers not only a significant number of entry-level jobs, but also given its focus on higher education and a lot of the tech jobs that require math and science skills, there hopefully will be ways to get more New York City residents on track for those jobs. And we'll talk about the current demographic landscape in tech sector. In the tech sector, there's a widely recognized need for it to become more diverse, and there's a commitment on the part of many leading tech companies to do that, and other leaders in the corporate and educational world in New York City to help the tech sector diversify. Next slide, please. So I would say overall at this point, there are about 400,000 payroll jobs in the tech industries in New York City, not only in the tech industries, but also in tech occupations in industries that we don't consider to be tech oriented per se. As of last month, that 400,000 would represent, almost 10% of employment in New York City. This is a sector that grew rapidly in the decade before COVID set in, adding 150 to 200,000 jobs over that time, at a rate 4 times the overall job growth in New York City. And that was a period of very strong, sustained job growth in New York City. So the tech industry is usually defined as industries that place a lot of emphasis on science and math skills. So the industries whose work is primarily tech oriented, but then there are also a lot of companies, and increasingly across the whole array of sectors, that because of the pandemic or because of trends that were at work before, are increasingly relying on tech skills. And within the tech sector, tech industries themselves, they're about 25% of the jobs don't require 20 to 25% of the jobs don't require a bachelor's or master's degree in tech industries, and provide a steady supply of entry-level jobs. These can be in administrative work, in marketing, and sales jobs. So there are a sizable number of entry-level jobs in the tech sector, and these are likely, by my best estimates, to grow in coming years 4 to 6% a year. And then plus there will also be continued growth in the tech-oriented jobs in the tech field that do require a bachelor's or a master's degree. And again, CUNY has been improving its academic offerings in that sector and developing additional connections to leading tech businesses. So we're likely to see that tech pipeline expand and more CUNY graduates move into those positions in the years ahead. Next slide. So just a backdrop on the COVID challenge. As of December, the city's only recovered about 55% of the jobs that we lost in those first 2 months when COVID was most severe. So our what I refer to as the pandemic jobs deficit is still about 420,000 jobs in New York City. That in itself is 8.5 to 9% of the total. These losses have been heavily concentrated among low-income workers of color, many young adults. We won't get back all of those lost face-to-face industry jobs or the companies that provided those. At the same time, we've seen economic changes that have increased the importance of tech. I mean, this has happened on a really demonstrative scale in the retailing environment with the acceleration of e-commerce. By some estimates, the e-commerce trend was accelerated by 5 years as a result of the pandemic. But also in all industries, tech industries, and throughout the economy, and broader dimensions of New York City life, an increased reliance on virtual programs like this and technology. In short, there's a dual focus to not only move dislocated and young New York workers into better paying entry-level jobs in the tech industry, but also do a better job and expand the tech pipeline for moving New York City residents and CUNY graduates into higher level tech jobs. Next slide, please, Lena. So there's a core, I'll talk about a core set of industries and then sort of the broader non-tech world where there are a lot of tech-related jobs. So, here the half dozen or so very specific, heavily computer-oriented tech industries: electronic shopping, software publishers, data processing and hosting services, internet publishing, computer systems design, and scientific research and development, which has a heavy computer and math component, but it's also more broadly into the physical sciences as well. For the most part, here we show employment numbers between the pre-pandemic month of February of 2020 and last month. The set of core industries had an employment growth, which is unusual over this time period when New York City's lost over 400,000 jobs. Growth in jobs in the core tech industry. In addition to these 185,000 jobs in these 6 very detailed industries, there are another 45,000 jobs in other tech industries like telecommunications, some jobs in computer and scientific equipment manufacturing in New York City, biotechnology, and so on. And then in the non-tech set of industries, there are an estimated 170,000 tech-related jobs. So you put these 3 components together, and that's about 400,000 jobs at the moment. Next slide. This slide shows the computer occupations. Now, computer occupations are not the full extent of tech-related jobs, but it is, it does constitute a huge share of tech jobs. So the latest data from 2018 for New York City from the Labor Department's Occupational Employment Data Program shows about 162,000 computer occupation jobs in New York City. This chart shows the education level required, and those that I've highlighted in yellow don't require a bachelor's degree. And you can see the pay levels for these. So these 3 yellow shaded industries comprise about 25% of all computer occupations. These are, effectively entry-level jobs that people can get without a 4-year bachelor's degree, or that you can get through, doing an intensive coding program or a certificate program at a community college, and so on. So this clearly, even within the set of computer occupations, a sizable number of entry-level jobs. Next slide. And so let's take a step back and look at here's the summary from a demographic analysis of how people in these computer occupations compare with all New York City workers. So not surprisingly, it's very heavily male-oriented. 78% of computer tech occupations are held by men versus 53% overall. Slightly more heavily white, much more heavily Asian, less likely for people in computer tech jobs to be Black. Only 9% compared to 18% overall in the city's economy. And similarly with Latinx workers, 11% in computer tech versus 25% overall. 81% of computer tech jobs required a bachelor's or a postgraduate degree. That's compared to 49% overall. So it's a workforce that skews toward higher education, male, white, and Asian. But even within that, significant numbers of other jobs. Next slide. So to give you an example of how tech is very promising, not only because it has a lot of entry-level jobs, but these are jobs that tend to pay much better than jobs for workers with a similar extent of education in other parts of the city economy. So I used here a couple of examples where the demographics in these computer support specialists and in this miscellaneous category, all other computer occupations, where the education and the demographic requirements are similar to the New York City economy overall, and yet look at the pay levels here at the 25th percentile wage in these computer-related occupations, more than twice the 25th percentile wage in the city overall. And when you look at the totality of Black and Latinx workers, this data is from the American Community Survey for New York City. You look at all Black and Latinx workers in computer tech occupations in New York City, they have their pay is 2/3 greater than the all industry average for workers outside of computer tech occupations. On the other hand, the pay is less for whites and Asians in tech than it is outside of that. But keep in mind that there are a lot of people who work in very highly paid finance and professional service jobs elsewhere in the New York City economy. Next slide. So, I'm moving toward the conclusion here. So, an increased reliance on tech during COVID, acceleration of e-commerce. We've already seen some net job growth in these computer occupations and industries. The outlook, according to the BLS projections for over the next 10 years, are that many of these occupations will continue to grow. Overall, computer occupations, employment computer occupations will grow twice as fast as projected employment overall. And many companies outside of tech are expanding their use of tech to be competitive. So this is one of the most promising occupational fields that are out there, and New York City has established a strong foothold in this industry, and the outlook is promising in that regard. Next slide. So for a lot of IT workers, there's less reliance in the hiring decisions on workers with computing degrees, and more reliance on what somebody's skill sets and demonstrated project-based experience can reveal. It's not unusual in going for an interview in a tech job to be given an assignment to demonstrate your skills, and that is a huge factor. So Those skills can be gained through boot camp training or similar, and is increasingly a way to get in the door at mid-sized companies. Larger companies are starting to go in that direction as well. At the same time, an expanding commitment to diversity programs on the part of some of the large tech companies in New York City. A report last year by Tech NYC and the Center for an Urban Future called Plugging In is a good source for over 30 programs providing IT training for adults. Next slide. So this is my final slide. So again, just to sum up, tech faces a huge diversity challenge, and New York City has the ingredients and a rich ecosystem that's demonstrated a commitment and a capability to expand the recruitment pipeline back into the public school system, not just throughout CUNY community and four-year colleges. At the same time, we need to make sure that we expand the accessibility of universal and affordable broadband. I mean, the pandemic has really underscored how absolutely essential that is. So again, tech promises to be, a key element in the city's recovery and future economic growth, both as a source of growth itself, and as a means to greater synergies and opportunities across all fields in the spectrum of industries in New York City. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Learned a lot, especially the 78% female metric is blowing my mind here. So I will now introduce our incredible panel, who are three powerful voices and leaders in New York City's tech community. First up, joining us is Bethany Crystal, who is Vice President for Portfolio Partnerships at Bolster. Welcome, Bethany. We have Jesse Owens II, who's a Vice President of Product and for Open Banking at Wells Fargo. Hi, Jesse. And Angela Pinsky, who is Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google New York. Welcome, everyone. So just to get started, if each of you could take a few minutes to introduce yourselves, your company, kind of your organization's role in the tech ecosystem, and any personal background within the field that you want to make sure to share that'll kind of impact how you answer some things. We have a very, as tech tends to go, there people enter from different types of places. So I would love to learn about that as well. Let's start with Beth.
Hey everyone, I'm Bethany Crystal. Apologies for my voice being a little off today. I'm in the middle of my COVID recovery. I've worked in the New York City tech sector for about a decade now across different startups and in VC. Today, I work at a company called Bolster. We are an on-demand marketplace for executive talent. So I've been seeing a lot about flexibility becoming more and more popular at the executive level, particularly in pandemic times. Prior to that, I worked at Union Square Ventures, New York City VC firm. We worked with over 100 different companies and startups. So I got to see the broad ecosystem of talent being deployed at various levels. I've been involved in workforce development initiatives since 2014 to encourage more New York City youth to find pathways at tech companies. Today, I sit on the board of CompSci High, which is a new charter school in the South Bronx. And I've been doing a lot with professional skills and soft skills training to help other youth get involved in the tech sector. Looking forward to speaking more.
Thanks, Bethany. And Jesse?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to meet you all. I've actually been in the tech space for a little over 15 years now, spanning across software development as well as product management. I started out my career as an engineer, started out in investment banking, then transitioned into education, which then led me into a foray into digital payments, and which kind of leads me now here at Wells Fargo. And essentially what my group does at Wells Fargo and the open banking team is really rethink how we democratize and make our products, our banking products, accessible to everyone through development tools like APIs, SDKs, really cool widgets that companies or entrepreneurs or startups can plug into and gain access to our network of products as well as our product offerings, as well as giving them the ability to help accelerate their go-to-market with their customers as it relates to creating banking solutions. So if you look at the proliferation of fintech companies and wanting to kind of bundle different commerce and payment experiences, we fit very nicely into those ecosystems as we make our products more available and more accessible and easily to integrate. Outside of my professional experience, I've spent quite a bit of time being a practitioner of product management through organizations like Product School, in which I've helped develop curriculums, as well as also served as a mentor to aspiring product managers looking to break into the industry, as well as being a part of advisory boards, namely the Knowledge House, which is really focused on creating access and the ability of making transitions into tech across a multitude of different vectors with data science, software development, et cetera. So aside from that, I just really am immersed in the community and really want to kind of serve as a thought partner, someone that you can collaborate with as we as we kind of delve into the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Jesse and Angela.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Pinsky. I'm the head of government affairs and public policy for Google New York. We have a big presence in New York. We're over 12,000 people now across our campus. And so my purview kind of spans where everyone works and lives, which is generally New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Before Google, I was in the Bloomberg administration working on economic development. I worked at REBNY for a little while, and then I worked at ABNY, the Association for a Better New York. So this is actually my first tech job. And hopefully I can hang with Bethany and Jesse as we talk about tech public policy. But I do get to work on initiatives where we work with community, and one of the big focuses is always about expanding access to CS education and tech workforce development. So I'm excited about this conversation.
So again, a wide variety of perspectives and different entry points. Similar to, I think, actually the workforce system, a lot of times people come from different backgrounds. So just really appreciate all of you offering that to us. So just to begin, part of the main challenge for job seekers, training providers, and businesses looking to enter and support the tech ecosystem is one of definitions and kind of what are we actually talking about when we say tech jobs, which encompass both tech and non-tech roles within tech companies, as well as tech roles at non-tech companies. It's a mouthful. So how does each of you define the tech industry and the various roles that comprises from your point of view? So this time, let's start with Angela.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever tried to define what tech is. I know, James had presented a lot of really interesting information, and I know his definitions of tech and computer science are largely very, indicative of sort of the trends that we're seeing across the industry. But there's some other studies that have been done by HRNA and Center for Urban Future that included roles like the construction involved in broadband deployment and things like that. So I think it can be a wide variety of roles. What I think is important is sort of those macro trends that James was pointing out, like that the access to these jobs, there is a similarity between a lot of what the training and skills are required for some of these roles and how they differ from other industries. But I would say anything, obviously there's the hard skills and coding of computer science, but really, I mean, every job is turning into a tech job to a certain extent. And I think I'm quoting from Andrew Raje when he says, it's no longer an ingredient in the pan, it's sort of the pan itself when you're talking about jobs in the economy for New York.
So I gotta unmute myself. Jesse, you want to go next?
Sure. So I guess to follow up on Angela's points, I really look at as tech as an umbrella, as an enabler. And I think it's an enabler of kind of what you do personally and what you do as a business. So if you think about if you think about a company and you think about core competencies of the company, you may identify opportunities to accelerate what you do in order to deliver value for your customers, or what you do from a personal standpoint, what can enhance your productivity and what can allow you to be more effective and be more productive. So I feel like that technology is that connective tissue to the company or the person to ultimately the outcome that they're trying to achieve. And with that, the roles that can comprise in tech can look very different at different companies. But if you kind of look at where kind of things are going, where there's a high focus on personalization, high focus on moving to the cloud or cloud computing, or if you look at security, those are all sort of pillars within the tech umbrella that kind of makes up what you do as a company and kind of what you look for as a consumer in order to feel safe, feel inclusive, and that the experience is really catered to what you're trying to achieve. And as far as like the roles are, they're constantly evolving. And I think it's really important to kind of follow, the companies that we kind of know and love and kind of what their focus areas are. And then you can kind of map to where some of the skills that are in demand or what's needed in order to help accelerate those strategies or those initiatives in order to get there, like data science, going back to the theme of personalization, not only data science, data engineering, data analysts, because you need to be able to kind of craft the insights in order to deliver the end product that ultimately is going to deliver value. I'll just pause there. I can certainly go on a tangent there, but just wanted to help frame kind of what technique means to me and the variety and the diversity of the roles that someone can make a transition into.
I can jump in if you'd like to continue the conversation. I spend a lot of my time in the startup sector, so I think a lot about how different startups can be appealing jobs for people early, mid, and late in their careers, and helping to really demystify what it takes to get a job at a startup. And the reality is that just like any other tech company, large or small, about only half of the jobs at tech startups are engineering based. So there's lots and lots of opportunity to immediately vault yourself into middle income, career-driven pathways by starting in entry-level sales, marketing, HR, support. There's a lot of opportunities there. You can get a sense of this too. Like I mentioned, I used to work at Union Square Ventures. This VC firm aggregates all job openings across all 100 of their companies. And of the 2,600 open jobs today, I just checked, only about 1,000 or 1,200 of them are engineering focused. So there's really, really massive amounts of opportunity. And I think helping particularly early in their career youth understand that there's a broad diversity where you can take any skill that you have and apply it to a job in a tech focused organization is a really big unlock that I think a lot of folks are starting to learn, and we can help to escalate that even further.
So lots of optimism there, which is always great to hear. So speaking of kind of the way that things have been going, James did a really great job of covering what has been happening over the last few years and from a macro kind of level. So if each of you could react to kind of the labor update that James provided, especially from where you sit in the ecosystem, how has the pandemic impacted your companies and the way that you see things moving forward?
I could jump in. I guess, unfortunately, it's not a surprise. the stats that James had provided. I think with that said, what the pandemic has, at least what it's taught me, and at least what I've tried to help emulate, is that we've learned to appreciate the process of building relationships remotely. Before pre-pandemic, I would just talk in New York City. There was always a meetup to attend. There was always some sort of panel discussion or a place where you can meet like-minded folks to build and connect, exchange business cards, and you can build relationships from that in-person interaction. I think what I've been doing and what I've advised, people that are in my network, is to kind of leverage those same connections that you fostered over the years to, create new connections. And I think from a recruiting and I guess appeal from a recruiting standpoint, I think you have to meet people where they are, and if they're, and really understand how to connect with them in the most effective way, because I don't think we can just go out and just implement a standard script on how to attract and engage prospective talent. We have to really be creative now and understand like what are the different sort of levers that we can sort of instrument virtually in order to garner attention and to make the work that we do relevant and applicable to those that are interested.
I can jump in here next. I think you'll see in those stats that he presented to the growth of tech in particular is still quite strong. Last year alone, New York City tech startups raised almost $50 billion. 30 companies went public in New York City last year. There is more and more need and desire for the growth of this. So I think in that sense, there's a lot of great opportunity. I think there's also a lot that opens up an access when you look at all remote ways to engage with folks. I personally have seen tech companies reach out to populations that they would never have been able to meet in person because the power of just being on Zoom is that much closer. The flip side of that, of course, is that it does make it a little bit tougher for new entrants to the space when you don't already have those previously built upon relationships, and it's really hard to break through. I think one overall trend that I'm seeing in the space, and to a large degree is what we're also seeing at Bolster, where an executive marketplace for people that are looking for on-demand work. That's work on an interim, fractional, project-based level. And this has just gone through the roof over the past 2 years. 1 in 3 executives has changed jobs in the last year. And we're just seeing a lot of people reprioritize what they're looking for. I think as company owners and company leaders, what we saw, 2018, 2019, was this idea that a company was providing everything for everyone: benefits, compensation, a physical space, a social network, a friend group. And now that's just becoming more and more decoupled. There are a lot of advantages to that because it does allow more flexibility, but I also think it requires more guidance and signal for folks that are just coming new into the sector. So for people at the executive level that have already built their networks and connections, it's easier to sort of break off. But for people who are just trying to come in, I think there's a lot of like kind of Sherpa work that we can help do to really guide folks into different pathways.
Yeah, I think also for Google, as a company, I think we saw the growth similar to pre-pandemic that we were expecting to see of our workforce. And in actuality, as a New Yorker, I thought it was sort of interesting to find that our office became more desirable during the pandemic compared to some of our other locations, which I always find heartening and I think is a great sign for the city and what it has to offer. To Bethany's point, I think Perscolis had done a study during the pandemic about tech jobs, and they had reported that there were more tech job openings in tech for the tech sector than there were healthcare job openings in New York during the pandemic, which was a healthcare crisis. So I think it just kind of speaks to, the increasing demands of what it's like to live in 2021 and 2022, and a lot of it involves being able to connect remotely. I think we saw a lot of people use the opportunity to assess where they wanted to go. And I think a lot of people switched interests towards tech during this time. And I think that there was a lot of ability, because the programs were offered remotely, for people to be able to get access to a variety of programs. And I think that's an interesting development, and it'll be interesting to see what continues in person versus remotely in terms of skills programs after we kind of meet more in person. But I think that that was an interesting transition from before, where it was a lot of in-person training. So hopefully, again, to Jesse's point, where we're seeking for different ways to meet people where they are, to increase the variety that we're delivering these programs, I think will only be helpful going forward.
And Beth, you alluded to this a little bit in your response, but how have your companies and how have other companies that you've been observing shifted their approach to hiring and talent development during the last few years? Are there any trends in hiring practices that you've seen, whether they're the same as they used to be or some that have shifted?
Yeah, I think in general, we're just seeing more flexibility be the number one option. And like it or not, there's no more one size fits all mode to what it means to work someplace. Some employees want the in-person atmosphere. Some employees want the completely remote atmosphere. And a lot of company leaders are really struggling to find out what that means in the middle. But I think beyond just like hybrid workplaces, I'm starting to see a lot more of just decoupling of work in general. So taking away the 9 to 5, one full-time job, and adopting several fractional or project-based roles. We're seeing this at the startup level from like, many different types of individuals all the way up to the senior levels. And this obviously requires a degree of independence and like professionalism and maturity in your career to sort of be able to take on a pathway that you're really carving out for yourself. But I think the more we're again decoupling where you're getting your benefits and your social life and your community from, people are looking for other ways to find and build that for themselves. And so we're seeing things like people, rather than hiring a full-time executive, they're hiring a part-time mentor or coach to train up their director level folks and help them learn the VP frameworks. Or rather than hire on a head of marketing to run a full-time project, they're hiring someone just for 3 to 6 months at a time. So I think when we're looking at entry points and pathways, it's important to also think about how do we start with like project-based work at all different levels. One other big shift that I'm noticing is that even when people are looking for new jobs, and so many people have changed jobs during this reprioritization, one big thing that we're noticing is that they're changing industries too. 75% of executives that we saw change last year switched industries. And it's not like they're going completely off the map. They're just kind of looking for something different. So I think another way to think about how we can encourage more of this flexibility into the early nascent kind of career building. You're not just studying to become a software developer and be that for every single role of your career, but how do you like grow and pivot that? How do you build this into the story that you're telling about yourself over time? And how can you think about using those pathways to kind of build upon your story, even if it changes and even if you're doing different things?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Bethany, and I think about my entry into tech, and you think about your onboarding into the company is, and it's really like, hey, you come here to do this, this is going to be your scope of work, rather than here's your journey and here's the different pathways that you can go, and we're here to provide you that opportunity to make pivots along the way. But I don't necessarily think that everyone is provided that opportunity to make those pivots gracefully. It's usually, those pivots are usually due to circumstances and not because of a company was intentional about crafting that journey for that employee or that person making the transition.
Thank you. And just kind of continuing the conversation on hiring and that entire process, part of obviously the thing that we've been seeing grow a lot more and the thing that we're most interested in is how workforce development providers can work with employers to create a talent pipeline of hiring into these both entry-level jobs as well as the other types of roles that we've been talking about. So what are, from your perspective, ways that workforce development providers can work with employers to build these kinds of programs, both the employment program and the training program? And what are some kind of components of programs that you've seen that are kind of a must-have? What are your top examples of characteristics of a training program that you find to be successful?
Yeah, I can start here. So I think there's a couple things that are worth acknowledging. So one is, again, the tech industry, as you had mentioned, is relatively young, and the demand is growing relatively quickly. And that kind of outsized demand over a shorter, truncated period of time is producing really difficult strains on the supply of talent. And so everybody's looking for certain skill sets, and there's lots of jobs available right now. And that's a relatively good problem to solve for, but it's still a problem that we need to solve for, right? And I think when we look at the workforce development programs, and we work with a lot of organizations and a lot of school systems on some of these issues on how to develop these programs, the lack of supply of talent extends to the trainers and educators and the administrators of these programs as well. So there is, there is a need for more people who understand these skills all across the board in order to keep growing like a healthy pipeline of talent. That being said, I think Bethany had mentioned this before too, like the project-based learning, I think is an absolute must. And it is not necessary to have a certain, formal education, and it's not necessary to have certain backgrounds and experiences, but a couple things. One is a strength in logic or math or, some of the input skills is something that I think we need to focus on, and making sure that the people who are interested in taking a tech job later in life get exposed to some of these skill sets as early as grade school, kindergarten, and that's all part of the pipeline. But as you get older and you are trying to figure out if you are interested in transitioning into tech or joining the tech sector, I think getting exposure to project-based learning, getting exposure to actually working in an environment where you're working with other people on some of these projects and solutions is really important. And I think that's one of the areas that we're all focused on is how to increase the supply of those types of experiences for everybody.
So I agree. Plus one on all those points. I think in addition to that, I think storytelling is a skill that is an absolute must in tech. Negotiation, as well as prioritization. I think those are components of your job. You can go across the stack of jobs in tech. You're going to encounter times where you either have to sell an idea or tell a story to up and down leadership, as well as amongst your peers in order to garner support. Rarely do you often can run and operate on a project by yourself without some sort of support of your peers or leadership in order to get certain projects off the ground and actually being able to launch. Negotiation, because I think with each role, you're going to encounter situations where there's going to have to be a conversation around trade-offs, especially from a engineering or product management or design. There are always trade-offs when you're thinking about building like the optimal customer experience. And then I think from a negotiation standpoint, I think that's important, as we talk about, kind of wage differentials amongst different cohorts. I think it's important to kind of build that into the framework along with the project-based learning, so that someone going into that program can get exposure to all of the skills, the soft skills, as well as the hard skills necessary in order to hit the ground running and be productive.
I agree with both of these. So hard agree on this. To answer the second part of your question, Annie, a couple of examples that come to mind of programs that I've seen and worked closely with that do this well. One is a program called Summer Bridge that I worked on for the past 2 summers with DYCD and a couple of folks on this call I see from the Mayor's Office of Youth Employment and Tech NYC. We helped repurpose part of the SYEP summer internship program to be accessible for tech companies, structuring what was a summer-long program into just a 6-week or 4-week workplace challenge that brought youth into the companies, gave them a challenge activity and a couple of touch points throughout the summer to really meet up and learn what are these people working on and how can I start to like get my hands involved, which turned out to be really, really successful just for exposure as well as like awareness. Another program that I'm close to that really touches on what you're saying, Jesse, about storytelling is the work I've seen done at Comp Sci High. This is a new charter school in the South Bronx. Their principal, David Noah, has been very strong in promoting career readiness from day one. All freshmen had mock interviews the very first week of their very freshman year and learned how to tell their own story. And by really putting them through the runner early, having them tell their story, getting them in front of actual recruiters at actual companies, practicing their resume pitching. The idea is by senior year, they're used to this stuff and they can get ready into those internship programs, ultimately jobs. And it's given me a lot of confidence that other high school students and other programs can do that kind of thing effectively as well. And the third thing I'll just echo is in general, soft skills tend to be overlooked from a lot of programs that I see. I think a lot of workforce programs spend time on the hard skills. I think that's really important, but I think it's also risky because these skills change so frequently. So the best students that I see are ones that know how to learn beyond the classroom, that are curious and know how to teach themselves and can kind of figure out how to navigate in these companies that are changing. If you get a job at a tech startup, you have a different job in 3 months than you did 3 months ago. So you have to be able to be mobile and adaptable to that. When I worked with some CUNY students for a couple of summers on a program called Beyond Coding, we really wanted to show that there are things you need to know beyond just coding in order to get the coding job. And one like pretty big oversight was when a lot of these students were looking at job descriptions and looking at the list of requirements needed, they were opting themselves out of applying because they didn't meet all of the requirements. And we were in front of a panel of hiring managers and recruiters, and all of them kind of laughed and they're like, oh, well, that's like an ideal list of requirements, but no one ever meets 10 out of 10 criteria. But unless you kind of had known that and known that inside industry intel, you're kind of self-selecting out of opportunities that might be a good fit for you. So I think this is why it's really important to do those soft skills and really help set that level of context for students as they're entering that career.
I think it's a really interesting point, and we're seeing a lot of organizations that we fund that do provide sort of the harder skill sets in tech, looking to expand their scope to provide one, the soft skills, and then two, you know, again, there's a variety of people coming from a variety of levels of readiness who would like to get those skill sets, but may need some additional help in financial literacy or numeracy or something else academic, or maybe they're having issues like childcare or health issues or something like that. And so there's an increased conversation that that we're seeing of organizations that provide those technical hard skills looking to expand to provide more soft skills and more wraparound services. And I think one of the things that we should as a community kind of think about is, does it make sense to ask every organization to develop and grow in that way? Or are there partnerships that we could be, you know, doing matchmaking and partnerships together to see if we can scale some of these things by having people who focus on some of these softer skills or some of these wraparound services to work with some of the more technical skilled organizations to, you know, have a multiplier effect on the number of people served. Because it is a real issue about, you know, getting people to a place where they're ready to take those courses and that those workforce development programs, and who are we leaving behind by not offering services to get them to that place.
Couldn't agree more, and I would say that's highly reflective of what our best practices are for across the board in workforce. Help people focus on what, if organizations are good at hard skills training, help focus on that, but definitely don't miss out on the soft skills or foundational skills training, because that's what'll help somebody actually gain their job and expand in their career. So, but it seems like that's particularly relevant within tech where there's so much fluidity once you enter your job. Just to slightly shift gears a little bit, in New York City, of course, the population is highly diverse and the representation in the tech and economy doesn't really reflect the diversity of the city. So how do we ensure that this growing industry creates opportunities for all New Yorkers? Kind of what are some ideas that you have or that you've been seeing working on the equity and diversity space?
Yeah, I can start. Google is working on a lot of different initiatives, and I think it's not directing all of its resources to one possible solution, but looking at multiple possible solutions. So I think that there's a lot of partnerships going on right now, working with HBCUs, developing programs, working with CUNY and SUNY on their curriculum development to make sure that more CS graduates from New York are accessing the opportunities in New York. And then also there's a growing recognition, I think, about the flexibility of being able to deliver these programs. So recently we had launched, in 2018, we had launched this IT professional certificate. And last year during the pandemic, we had released 3 more certificates in UX management, data analytics, and project management. And again, these are all self-driven online. They're about 120 hours. Everybody in New York, actually, because of the state, is able to access these certificates for free, so they can take them as they want to. And I know a number of other large tech firms are offering similar programs. Amazon in particular, I think, has a cloud professional certificate that they're offering. So again, like I think it's a recognition that not everybody comes to the table in the same circumstance and with the same skills. And so it's trying to broaden the offerings to invite more people to partake in the opportunity. And, as I had mentioned this in a previous conversation, but in addition to us trying to grow the diversity of Google kind of globally, I think New York is of particular interest because its population is so naturally diverse, and the number of industries that are represented here and the backgrounds of people and where their experiences are and where they're coming from is so naturally diverse in New York that when you think about trying to diversify your workforce, to look to New York as one of the places that you can source a lot of that diverse talent, it makes a lot of sense for a lot of these bigger companies as well.
Yeah, I guess, I'll just preface this by saying, it's not just one solution. There's many solutions that's going to help address the diversity deficit that I would say the tech industry faces. I'll speak to some of the programs that I've felt like that worked, or at least that helped with the engagement and the building of the pipeline of diverse talent into companies. I think apprenticeships are helpful when there's when you have sustained commitment to diversity, especially to those who may not come from traditional backgrounds, giving them an opportunity of having work experience with industry professionals is certainly helpful. Another sort of concept is like an office hack where essentially you can have a pool of representatives from the company sort of meet and greet people that are interested in tech, because I think part of it is I think we have to break down some of the the assumptions or reservations of making the transition into tech. And I think it's creating that top of funnel of getting people interested and delighted and excited about making the transition into tech is the first step. Now, once they kind of funnel through that part of the funnel, it's all right, now how do we set them on certain tracks in order to kind of build that relationship? So I think with those sort of programs, it gets the excitement that this is actually possible. Because I'm pretty sure that we can tap on a number of our colleagues and they can share their story about their journey into tech, and all of those stories are different. And there isn't like a standard way of making the transition. It's really about having the commitment and drive to, get to that next step in your journey. It's really just getting to the next step. And first, it's just what's of interest to me of all these breadth and depth of roles. How can I make that, that first step? But I'll just pause there because I can certainly go on a tangent, but I just wanted to just help frame. I think the part of that, getting the community engaged is just showing them what's possible. And it's not, sometimes we kind of get blinded sometimes, within our own walls of our companies, thinking that everyone is familiar of what we do from a tech perspective. And we just kind of have to touch, and make that, very visible and available to those that are interested.
I think a lot has already been said here, but maybe one final note is we've talked a lot about project-based work being useful for the students and the youth. I don't think we often think about it being useful for employers, but the fact is it's really, really helpful. And particularly for smaller companies, it can be really hard to commit to a 6-month-long internship program. But really what we're trying to do is maximize exposure on both sides. So the idea of that like forum event that you were talking about, Jesse, where you have kind of folks from both sort of mixing and mingling is great. I think job shadows are really great. I attended for a different industry once, a +1 event where everyone had to bring someone that was like completely outside the industry and didn't really know people there as a way to sort of like boost and lift that. So I think the more we can take these robust programs and break them down into components that are really easy for folks to tap into, that makes it really accessible and just becomes more and more a part of the day-to-day.
Yeah, and to add on to that, like before COVID, we used to bring classrooms through the offices, and now we do a lot of virtual classroom teaching. And I'm always surprised at how much some of the feedback is based around like, oh, you really showed a lot of these students the different types of jobs and opportunities that are offered in tech and in places like Google. And I'm always surprised that that's like the first reaction that we get, that we do have a long way to go to kind of teach awareness about the different roles that exist here, because I think most people think it's like 2 or 3 jobs that all of Google does, and there is so many interesting roles to play at a company like this, or any of these other startups to big companies. And I think we have to do a better education campaign collectively about all the different types of opportunities that are available.
So you're saying not everyone at Google is Keanu kind of coding away. That's, yeah, absolutely. And it's especially, we have to think about how do we then create that interest and also ability to actually see what those roles look like in a digital environment when you can't bring people into your office. That's definitely a challenge. And I see a lot of chatter in the chat looking for those kinds of connections. So we'll certainly, this is definitely a first step. So I'll ask one more question around public policy, and then we'll bring it over the Q&A into the session. So as we've talked a lot, it's a very complex system, a lot of complex set of businesses that are part of the ecosystem. So how can local government support the growth of local tech businesses, as well as the talent development that needs to be supporting those businesses through public policy? And where should resources be most targeted, especially in ensuring that non-traditional talent and marginalized New Yorkers can access the economic opportunities presented by a booming tech sector, again, through a public policy lens?
So I think my answer as somebody who represents an employer is going to be very different than what your membership workforce development providers and education providers is going to say. But I would say, one, the first step for everything is to be a convener, right? There's a lot of information sharing that can be done. I think I think a lot of people are working collaboratively here, but there's, the city could really benefit from having one or two collective spaces where everybody can kind of come together and share ideas and deposit information and best practices and pull from that same pool. And the other kind of role that I think is helpful is sort of defining like a broader vision of, what are the needs that, we all should be directing a lot of resources towards. Where are the gaps? What are some of the major issues? And not have everyone kind of point themselves to that, but provide, a picture of what would be really helpful for moving the most number of people from, not ready for these opportunities to ready for these opportunities. And I think, because again, I look around on this list of people who are here today, and we work with a lot of people, but it's a lot of individual one-to-one relationships. And I think if we were part of a bigger system and a bigger collective objective, and we knew where we sort of fit and where our efforts were fitting into that bigger objective, then that would provide a lot of direction for New York City. I also think that it's important for us to remember that we are kind of in a competition with other cities. And I am a firm believer that New York is always the best positioned out of any other US city, but talent is mobile, and so are some of these companies. And I think we should be thinking of this as a team effort that we kind of have to all pitch in together on.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, Angela. I'm particularly the idea that we want kind of more of an umbrella approach to everything. Working at different startups and in VC, I can just tell you, like, folks are really, really busy on the industry side of things, and it's really hard to pay attention to all the fantastic things that are happening, even the ones that are really well-intentioned or ones where we might want to be involved. So I talk with Tech NYC a lot about this problem, and I'm working with some of the team there to see if we can help sort of be a convener for some of the great work that's happening and help folks kind of streamline and direct them. Again, sort of serving as like the signal through the noise there for what's happening in New York, and how do we get the introductions to the folks that we want to meet that will make a difference for us. I think the other thing, this maybe is less of a policy and more of just a, if you do work with communities of groups that maybe aren't as represented in tech, is really helping tech companies think about hiring in recruiting in a different lens. Like, I think a problem is that some of the language that is used a lot is a little bit coded and is a little bit based on the people that built and defined that language and those frameworks 5 and 10 years ago. And it's not always fair to apply that lens with every different aspect of interviewing and hiring and managing. So I think to the extent that we can help sort of demystify that and use slightly different language or look at things in a slightly different way to help employers kind of learn that there's different approaches to the same problem, would be helpful in the long run.
+1. I honestly don't have anything else to add. I agree on all the points, Bethany and Angela.
Lots of agreement, lots of work ahead of us. So now we're going to open it up for a few questions from our members in the audience. We'll be listing, we have already begun to list participant names in the chat in the order that you'll be called up to ask a question. So our first question comes from Marie Roker-Jones, who is the CEO of Esteem. Marie? I'm just having this late getting brought up onto the panelist side. And
sorry, I was waiting for it to let me in. Sure. Thank you, everyone. It was a great panel conversation. I had a question really around getting junior people who are more boot camp graduates, getting them hired, because that's one of the challenges we're seeing is that, we work with like our community has 80% of women in tech. A lot of them are boot camp graduates, and they struggle to find opportunities that are more junior level. So do any of the companies, or do you know, like, what should they do? Like, we organize hackathons and add projects for them, but what else can they do to kind of get more, I guess, experience or get hired?
Hi, Marie. You may not love this answer, but I will say that I think what's important, like post boot camp, that they gain access to people that are already in the industry that can help kind of guide them on that journey of making that transition from boot camp into industry. I would just reflect back on my experience being a practitioner at product school. One of the things that I was intentional about doing when all my students kind of graduated from the program was that I had a sit down with them to really assess kind of what they wanted to do next as far as making a transition to product, and try to and really just make soft introductions into those that are already in the industry or that may have like similar experiences, to one, have a person that they can sort of tap into, and then to kind of further grow their network. But then you can be introduced to someone that can create a direct pathway into an interview, as opposed to, going on various job sites, LinkedIn, having to apply, and you just get kind of in that pool of applicants. So I would really, really advocate for networking and tapping into industry professionals that can, help make those soft introductions to recruiters, to hiring managers. Because I'll be honest, it's very competitive, although that there's a ton of growth, and that those relationships can certainly help facilitate and create those connections and the ability of making that transition a bit more smoothly.
We also have a team here that can meet with the organizations that do the boot camps, and they do this with universities and other schools to say, like, here's how you can submit, structure your resume to make it to give it more visibility into types of skill sets that a company like Google is looking for, or like, here are the things that you should highlight. And to that end, if that conversation is helpful, to have that same conversation with some of the graduates of the bootcamp programs, then you can reach out to me and we can set that up.
Thank you. Next up, we have Justin Collins from WPTI.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for doing this event. It's been really informative. I just had a question. There's a tension that exists between a lot of the talk coming from the tech field and a lot of what we're hearing now about how it's a lot more about what you can do and those practical skills as compared to credentials, degrees, et cetera. And at the same time, when we look at the data that James provided earlier, the sector is still overwhelmingly, 80+% individuals with at least a bachelor's degree. How do we explain this tension, and then how do we address it? Because, obviously there's more opportunities coming about, which is encouraging, but we don't want to replicate again this, inequity that exists, especially for folks who don't have a college degree. Thanks.
I can jump in here. I think one thing off the bat is that you don't always need a degree in the topic that you're getting hired to do. So even if you're getting hired as a software developer and you have a bachelor's degree, like, it might not be that you study computer science, right? You might have just completed a bachelor's degree and then taken some CS courses or taken a boot camp afterwards. So I think one thing is making sure that youth are aware that they don't need to make the decision of how their entire career is going to go necessarily, but seeing it as a step and a pathway is definitely one. And then the other thing I would say is I do think that project-based work and proof of that kind of independence and autonomy is just something more and more employers are excited to see. So, and coming back to the boot camp question a little bit too, like I'd be curious if some of the women in that boot camp have their own websites and have their own projects and have done internships and that kind of thing. So all of those little things do really add up. I think in a lot of job descriptions that I see, there is still like a general bachelor's degree requirement, but it's like it's not often tied to the degree type of the role itself. And I do see more and more flexibility in that over time.
Yeah, it was a very interesting question, and I actually had to take a moment and kind of reflect. Um, I think we have not addressed the elephant in the room, and that there is confirmation bias. There is some biases around what good looks like. Unfortunately, that impacts on who gets hired and who does not. Let's just be transparent on that. I think with that said, I think there are creative ways that you can kind of get more visibility into the work that you do, particularly around kind of leveraging networks, I think outside of LinkedIn, that can be a way of kind of building advocacy around what you do. I think platforms I think about is GitHub. So like if you're an engineer and you have a project that you're working on, kind of building a network of other people that you can join or join a project that are, that a lot of folks that are working on, that's an opportunity of not only building your network, but seeing where they work at, and they can essentially provide inroads to you, inroads for you in order to get access to those jobs. I think because we just have to be, honest with ourselves. Those are some of the things that we just have to break down, some of those biases. And I think publishing your work is part of the battle, but then it's also making your work visible and people actually paying attention to the work that you do is another thing. And I think there's some tactical ways that you can go about getting exposure to the work that you do, either writing about it or tagging folks that you feel like may be interested into what you're building. So it's really being very intentional and deliberate who you connect with, and building projects that's relevant for the role or the group that you would like to join, or the organization rather. So I just say all that because it's tough, because you're not going to change what good looks like across the whole ecosystem, but I think you can change the way in which you promote and market yourself in the work that you do, and that should have some tangible outcomes.
I also think, we talked a little bit before about education of the types of roles within the tech sector. And I also think that there is a need for education on where you can get tech experience, because I think that there's a lot of places where tech skills are needed and where people can gain experience that are not the first places that most people will think of. Just going from my personal history, when I was at working for a nonprofit, it was very difficult to find talent that could help us move to the next level in terms of communication and in terms of information sharing, to work for an organization like a nonprofit, a small nonprofit. And so I think that there is sort of this mismatch of demand and supply, both on the skill side and on the employer side. And I think we could all do better about educating people on where to find some of this experience across the board, because I do think a lot of it, particularly in New York, where there's so many different sectors that use tech, there's a lot of people who are having a harder time finding those opportunities.
So our next question is from Carol Sonnenblick, who's the Dean of the Division of Continuing Education at New York City College of Technology. I'm just going to ask it on her behalf, which is around credentials and certification. So what are the most useful certifications for adult career changers with degrees and interest but no certifications that would make them eligible for employment in tech jobs? And you could really broaden that to what types of certifications do you find to be kind of the most sought after in a variety of roles? So even kind of getting out of the coding space, but any other roles that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I'll do a little self-promotion here. I'll go back to the 4 that Google, the Grow with Google team had focused on. So out of the 4 areas, IT, user experience management, project management, and data analytics, there are currently over 1.3 million jobs available in those 4 categories in the US. And again, they're all jobs that I think have an increased ability to do remotely. So you're not limited to doing it in the place where you're learning, but there are skills that are high in demand. So those are kind of 4 areas where I think from our research, we think are areas that you could easily obtain those skills through a certificate program. Also, we do have an apprenticeship program that is also in those 4 areas. And then in addition to that, it's software engineering, and one more, which I can't remember, but I swear it's on our website if you wanted to take a look. And the apprenticeship program that we have, it started off last year with about 25 nationally, and now we're over 110, which I think is a tremendous growth from one year to the next. A lot of the positions are based out of New York, again, because I think we have a big office here that can support a lot of apprentices, but also we are anxious to have our growth from New York as well.
My quick maybe counter to that is I rarely in working at startups, working with HR managers at startups and working for startup leaders would see people look for a certificate on a resume. It didn't really stand out as much as a project or actual work or an internship or an apprenticeship in that space. That's not to say it's never useful, but it's not always the number one thing that people look for. In fact, I think it's rarely the number one thing that people look for. So I think it might be really, really helpful if you're completely pivoting. I can see that being like a useful direction, but if you're doing a certificate just to add a line to your resume, I would actually advise instead doing some project work, doing an internship, doing something else, because that will probably stand out a little bit more.
+1 on that.
And our last question will come from Elise Harris, who is the internship coordinator at Hunter College.
Hi, I would like to thank all the panelists. You've all been really wonderful, and I've learned a lot. And I wanted to ask if any of you had anything to say about changing patterns of hiring specific to the pandemic, because as everyone knows, many internships were canceled for summer 2020. And then there was this great hope that for summer 2021, they would come back in summer 2022. But both internships and entry-level hiring have been pretty inconsistent. And it seemed like a lot of hiring was booming at more senior levels, partially probably to do that with how difficult it is to onboard people remotely and how difficult it is to build these relationships and without these direct interactions. But I think there must be other dimensions to it. And I'm very lucky that most of the programming I did related to computer science. I've been working for the Tech Talent Pipeline for 6 years, working with first all 11 CUNY senior colleges and now Hunter for 3 years. But, we had great success, particularly when entry-level hiring was good. And it's a really different story now. And I just wanted to know any predictions from you guys, any thoughts about why, maybe tech kept hiring, but not entry-level.
Well, I guess I don't think I'm in liberty to predict what's the future hold, what's the future for us. I think what I will say, it really depends on where the organization is, particularly their group, and kind of where their kind of growth trajectory is, because it may be certain groups or certain organizations are just at a point where they're scaling, their essentially their workforce, and that's essentially the roles that they need to fill is a bit more senior rather than junior. So it really depends on the makeup and the mix of teams that actually warrants the demand for kind of new hires, or more so like junior hires. So I think my answer to that is it really depends, and it just really depends on the organization, the team, and ultimately kind of what's the vision of that hiring manager and the topology of their team, and that what that topology is going to look like, and kind of how that maps to the overall sort of outcomes that they want to achieve. So unfortunately, that's a difficult one for me to answer around the future, but I would say when you're looking at hiring someone junior, you should have very clear intentions on, why you want to kind of build out the depth of your team in regards to having a good mix of experiences. Because you could have situations where you're very top heavy and you need someone that can come in and sort of learn and be mentored and groomed. But sometimes organizations and teams aren't necessarily ready to mentor. So I think it's really a mix of organizations being ready, and then there being a demand of kind of mentoring and sort of cultivating sort of young talent. Sorry if that I don't know.
And I'll agree. It's kind of hard to speak to this without knowing exactly where sort of the retractions in the internships and entry level positions were. But I would say, one of the things, and Bethany had mentioned this before, like I actually thought that one of the most successful pivots during COVID was the summer youth employment program. I thought there was an infrastructure that was built kind of outside of the companies and outside of government within these nonprofits to be able to house these teams and then bring in the skill sets from the employers to these teams. And I think that is an innovative way of providing scale to some of this project-based learning and some of these experienced mentors, senior people in the tech industry. And I think that we should continue to look for ways to do that kind of across the board, because I think we do have a lot of startups, and I think a lot of people are willing to offer their help and services. But people who work at startups are working tremendous hours, and they're doing everything that they can to keep their businesses growing and afloat. And then you have large scale employers that have a lot of very structured programs. And so, I think that there's a lot of places where we can think about how to create different structures that provide people with similar experiences, outside of the structures that we offer today.
And one sort of kind of related comment, Elise, I agree with you that it's certainly harder for employers to onboard and train up interns in a COVID era. I think there's been a lot of studies that show that the younger employees are the ones that are really suffering the most from not getting that exposure and that mentorship. And it doesn't surprise me to hear that you're having a hard time finding placements for those folks. One sort of related trend, but potentially related, that I've seen during the pandemic has been the rise in Gen Z tech folks banding together, forming their own communities and making their own opportunities. And this is something that I find really inspiring. There's a whole tech community of 13,000 people in what they call Gen Z VC. They're not just people in the VC world, they're in tech, they're in startups. By the way, there's twice as many of them in the New York Slack channel than the SF Slack channel, if that's any indication as to where tech is booming. But what I'm noticing now is that this is the generation that is most socially connected, most digitally engaged. They are finding their own opportunities, they are discovering each other, and they're looking for ways to find jobs in places that are a little bit less traditional. That's not to say this is a path that's going to work for everyone, but it's certainly something that I think the most ambitious and curious and creative folks are already discovering. So I'd be curious if there's any opportunities that they can kind of like lead into themselves as their own sort of entrepreneurs on their own journeys earlier on.
Well, it's a lovely optimistic note to end on. Super appreciate all of you for being with us today, both on the audience side and the speaker side, and earlier having James. Thank you so much, Jesse, Bethany, and Angelina. Oh, sorry, Angela. My name's Angelina. Thank you so much for sharing your diverse expertise and perspectives with us, especially getting down to the really nitty-gritty of the changes that you've been seeing. Again, we'll be sharing this presentation with the audience moving forward, and we look forward to working with you in the future. So that concludes the second installment in our Industry Needs by Sector series. The quick program note before you drop off, please join us on Thursday, February 17th for the third installment, where we'll be speaking about the state of building trades. This will be followed by the state of healthcare on Thursday, March 3rd, and media and entertainment on March 17th, respectively. Stay tuned for speaker announcements and visit nycetc.org/events or see the RSVP link in the chat to register today. Again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And of course, I want to once again thank our panelists. Enjoy the rest of your day.